Hey guys, Wolverine here with a video on drafting fundamentals. Surprisingly, these concepts aren't actually seen in almost any team across the world. These drafts won't be things you see in pro play. I may make a video on that later and why that is, why pro teams draft the way they do, but for now this one is going to be purely on how teams should be drafting and the basics of it. It's going to be very simplified because drafting gets really complex the deeper you go. So this will simply be the basics, the fundamentals, how drafting actually works. So rule one, this is by far the most important one, is above all, you want to avoid being counterpicked compositionally. So this is the basis of all drafting. All 10 picks, all the bands, everything is around this. The main way this is done is that early in the draft, you want to pick champions that can fit in and against any composition. So 2 will be the inverse of 1, which is you want to counter the enemy team's composition without committing too hard in the early rounds, which we will get into later. To explain compositions, they can basically all fit within one of 3 types. You got engage, anti-engage, poke, and long range. These kind of work as like a rock, paper, scissors, where obviously engage loses to anti-engage, anti-engage loses to poke, poke loses to engage. To further explain these, you can look at engage, because engage is actually kind of a confusing term. It's more just a composition that wants control. They want agency. They're very aggressive in the early game. They're trying to control the game, and then they're trying to go into you, look for kills, find your mistakes, accelerate their lead, and end the game. Anti-engage is obviously the inverse of this, where they're not trying to actually create leads for themselves so much as they're trying to stop you from creating leads, because they're going to most likely be scaling. Poke and long range, obviously, if a composition is purely poke, it's going to probably spike in the mid game, where they're going to try to force you off towers through poke, force you off objectives, and accelerate their lead, not really from killing you, but from forcing you off of things. If you do take a fight, you're already so low that you're dead. So every champion fits into one of these archetypes, but the important part is that some of them fit into multiple or all of them. And those are the champions that you want to be picking early. So for example, champions on the engage side are generally champions like Lee Sin, Elise, Pantheon Talia, Jace. Jace is a champion that goes into 2, because Jace is actually poke, but he fits into the aggressive early game side of engage. So while Jace doesn't bring his own engage, he facilitates what these compositions want to do. So Jace would be both of these. Now, 3 and 4 is you want to create a composition in which all of your champions can play well together. So this doesn't necessarily always mean that you're going to be picking 5 champions that are all within the same archetype, but you want them all to be able to play within each other's archetype. So for example, Jace is probably more poke, but he fits very well with engage, with the aggressive early game. And then 4 is you want to maintain the ability to create a scaling advantage, which is really important because it just gives you a lot more options. So going into the mock draft here, we're going to get an Aatrox blind pick, super popular first pick throughout almost all of Season 9, even a little bit of Season 10, but it's actually a really bad pick because it breaks a lot of these rules. So, first of all, Aatrox is not a champion that can fit in and against any composition. He almost entirely falls within engage, within aggressive early game. He wants to go in, and he goes in one way. It's just, he purely runs at you. His engage is very linear, his playstyle is very linear, and he doesn't really have a way to switch it up in any way. So, the response to Aatrox should be that you start going into anti-engage, but you can't spec into it too hard too soon, which is the part of rule number 2. So if the response here was simply Viger Alawi, which are very, very strong anti-engage champions, you've now gone too hard into anti-engage and you've allowed the enemy team to pivot. So the response here can just be something like the Karma Ezreal, and blue side can pivot into a poker long range comp. Now, yes, blue side is breaking rule number 3 with these picks because they're picking champions that do not work together with Aatrox. Karma and Ezreal don't want to play with Aatrox on their team. Karma and Ezreal want to stay back, they want to poke, they never want to engage. But the reason they can break rule number 3 is they're forcing you to break it as well. Because red side has spec'd so hard into anti-engage that these picks are really devastating for them. So much so to the point that they are forced to now pivot out of it or lose the game. If red side simply tries to pick 3 more anti-engage champions, blue side will just continue to pick poke, and they will just win. So red side is now forced to try to pivot to engage or try to match the long range of blue side, but they now have 3 picks available for that when blue side has 4. So this is a very hard losing line for red side, which is why this rule is very important. You can't commit too hard to your counter in the early rounds. You want to keep your team composition fluid. So the actual response to this, and as you see, Ornn, Ivern, and Soraka are banned because I think these champions are very broken and I would generally pick them, but I think they're confusing within this draft because it gets very complex, so I'm going to leave them out. The responses to this aren't going to be super optimal because I'm trying to keep it very classical and easy to understand. So the general response here will be something like Gangplank Syndra. And this is good because both these champions are very fluid. They can operate within any of these archetypes and they don't really have a lot of hard counters. Syndra does have low mobility, so she is a bit vulnerable there. She also lacks sustained damage, but she has enough going for her that she is a solid early pick, and both of these champions are very good into engage and what Aatrox is trying to do. Obviously, you've now secured the scaling advantage for yourself with the Gangplank and the Syndra. Blue side can't actually force it back without you letting them. And so at this point, since the Syndra and the Gangplank are essentially very fluid right now, blue side has nowhere to pivot. They can't pivot to poke like they could if you had a Lowy Viger. So what's most likely going to happen is they're going to double down on their engage. If they try and just pick very fluid champions from here, the problem is you now have a jump on them. Like, if they go through all these 4 trying to play fluid with you, they're most likely going to end up with a draft that doesn't work well together because they already have a champion that only does one thing. So you still have the opportunity on red side to have 5 champions doing the same thing, and you can force blue side into going off of engage, and then they will be not working well together. So what will likely happen is a Jarvan and MF will come in, or champions like them, champions that want to engage, champions that have a lot of agency, have a lot of control, they can go anytime they want. And this is also a very popular response to the Syndra, where if Jarvan can land an R when Syndra splashes down, MF will simply ult on top of it and Syndra will die. Now a good response here would be something like the Soraka or the Ivern, because compositions like this tend to operate on very thin damage margins in that they need to have their combos kill you. Jarvan R and MFR has to kill Syndra, or this team composition is just going to run out of damage and then they lose the fight. But since these champions are banned, you can see something come out like the Poppy. Poppy is, again, very flexible. She can go into 3 or 4 roles, top, jungle, mid, and support. And she's very good into the Jarvan. She probably is intended to go into the jungle this game, has very good 1v1 matchup, and is very good into this composition because it's very reliant on engaging into you. Poppy obviously very good at stopping that engage. Currently, the Jarvan goes for an EQ, gets knocked up, now he can't R, probably shouldn't even be in range of R, so this composition is already looking like it's going to have a very hard time getting onto these champions, and if they can't get onto these champions, they just lose, because that is this composition to win con. So for red side bans right now, you're trying to force them further into this. So what you want to do is you want to ban out something like the Rumble or and the Orianna. Something like Ziggs or Vel'Koz would also be good because these champions are going to combo very well with Jarvan, and they're going to kind of pull them out of being super linearly engage. These champions will still make this team comp overall in the engage or aggressive early game category, but it gives them more options, it gives them more flexibility, and since you don't have the Soraka or the Ivern, pure damage is a bit of a problem for you. This team, what it's good at is stopping the enemy team from coming into them. It doesn't have a direct response to straight up long range damage. So for your fourth pick, on the red side, you would probably just go something like the Ezreal, and Ezreal, again, he's a very fluid champion, he can go anywhere. He mostly sits inside the poke category. He doesn't actually offer any anti-engage himself, but he can play very well in anti-engage compositions because he's totally fine with playing back, and he doesn't need anyone to peel for him. So the response here from blue side will probably be something like a Nautilus followed by an Echo, maybe a LeBlanc. They really operate in the same way. And R5 is generally going to be the strongest pick if you're drafting like this. You generally want to leave it for your support, but it does depend on how the draft is going. But because support has such strong champions for things like this, there's a lot of options here, and all of them just ruin the game for blue side. You can lock the Zyra, you can lock the Viger. All of these champions are very off meta because they're very bad on their own. These champions aren't very strong, they're not well rounded, they're super, super niche. And the more niche a champion is, the harder it is to pick in general. So that's why you just don't see these champions picked at all. It's because teams don't really understand when they can come in. So if you look at these actual team compositions though, Zyra is the strongest champion in the game. Because you look at how this team wants to engage, they're all just going to try and run in. Zyra E and Zyra ult, as well as the Zyra plants, are incredibly strong into what this team is trying to do. They're going to hit a Nautilus hook, then the Poppy W is going to come down as J4 tries to EQ, so J4 has now been knocked out and is grounded. Zyra has placed her ult down, GP has placed his ult down, so these are two strong zoning abilities. Aatrox, Echo, Nautilus, Jarvan, they're going to have a very hard time coming into a Zyra and a GP ult. If they do decide to come into those ults, they're going to be slowed down and they're going to be knocked up while also taking a significant amount of damage both from the effects and from the plants, and then obviously all of these champions while they're CC'd. MF does have a hard time dealing damage outside of her ult when GP ult and Zyra ult are active, since she can't just walk into them, especially as this team is kiting back. And then Syndra QE is also very good at stopping Jarvan, stopping Aatrox. In this composition, you'd probably want to save it to cancel the MF ult, but it could be used for anything. You could ruin any champion you wanted with the Syndra stun, but you have enough protection from the Zyra, from the Poppy, from the Gangplank that you can just cancel the MF ult with it. Ezreal obviously isn't helping anyone anti-engage, but he doesn't need anyone to peel for him. He's just going to be dealing damage. He's going to be very safe. He just can't get caught. So as you can see, if you're actually picking fluid picks early and picking to counter the enemy's composition, it gets very hard for them to play. Now, I want to talk about split because this is a very common response when teams lose team fighting. A lot of coaches or analysts will look at this composition and say, blue side should just 1-3-1. The problem is that this doesn't help them. 1-3-1 isn't really a viable strategy, even if you think it's good, because the problem with splitting is you need to, one, either have a scaling advantage, or two, have really good lane matchups. So this side obviously doesn't have the scaling advantage, which again is why you want to maintain it. It creates more options for yourself. If this team did have the scaling advantage, say maybe they lose these team fights at 20 minutes, maybe at 25 minutes, but they can just 1-3-1, spread out the game until 30 or 35 when they do start winning fights, and then they can team fight. But that isn't the case here. So the only way splitting would actually be good for a team that doesn't have a scaling advantage is if you either have dive or kill threat in your side lanes. And this is pretty rare to see, especially if you're drafting well, and it doesn't happen here. Echo and Aatrox obviously can't just hit the towers and ignore Syndra or GP in the same way that Tryndamere could to a Maokai, and they don't actually have dive threat on either one of these champions no matter how you switch up the matchups. Jarvan can't go for dives because Poppy can simply follow him, and Poppy is in her own terrain where she can move easier, she has more vision. So splitting is just going to stall out the game, which is not good if you have a scaling disadvantage. But the problem is you also can't teamfight, but you are eventually forced onto Baron and Dragon because you need to end the game. Or every minute that passes, the game gets more difficult to end. But when you do eventually go onto the Baron and the Dragon, you do lose that teamfight. Because red side can just approach, start poking with the Ezreal and the Syndra, the GP barrels, whatever. They can force you off. If you try to engage, you lose. Now, this draft isn't even actually that one-sided. I would put this at probably a 35-65 for red side. It is very, very difficult for blue side to play this game. But there are much, much worse drafts than this that are possible every single day in pro play. I see them all the time. I see probably a 2080 draft possibility every single day of pro play and amateur. And if teams really get good at being fluid in your early picks and knowing how to counter when the enemy team is not fluid, you can have much better drafts and win a ton of games purely in Champ Select.